Yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, hey, man, it's great to meet you. I'm looking forward to delving into the brand new album and kind of your world of music. But before we get to that point, how did you survive COVID? How did you get through the pandemic? And how has it subsequently changed you now that everything's waking up? You got a new album out. How's everything going?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was in Los Angeles at the time of the pandemic when it happened, and then all through 2020. Um, uh, yeah, in terms of the music work, obviously, the live performance kind of shut down, almost overnight. So that was a non-starter for a good year and a half. So um, there was a little bit of recording work that you might know other musicians, Joe, that remote recording, right,
Yeah.
was kind of a big trend. So yeah, definitely had a little bit of work coming through that, which helped, sustain a little bit of the music side. Um, at the time, I still had a separate non-music job. So that, financially, obviously, that helped kind of sustain me throughout that whole year period. But um, yeah, that was in terms of kind of creativity and writing wise, that was actually a pretty important period for me. Just because, with all the other distractions gone away and not really being able to do anything else,
Yeah.
it was actually kind of the first time in a while that I had where I just had all this time, outside of the regular day job, and I had all these hours throughout the day, whether it was to practice or to write, to transcribe things, to learn tunes that I've been meaning to learn. And so, yeah, I hate to say, I guess a big silver lining for me coming out of 2020 was, yeah, really being able to kind of refocus. A lot of the music that's on the album was written or finished in that period.
Yeah.
And so definitely was able to kind of zone in and focus on kind of really what I wanted to do. Um, and then this is a little bit tangential, but I guess fall of 2020, that's when I ended up making the move to Seattle from Los Angeles. And that was also related to the day job that I had at the time.
Yeah.
And so, in hindsight, it was a pretty pivotal move in terms of music career,
Yeah.
just because the move to Seattle is what allowed me to, start pursuing music full time and, have a lot of these new opportunities that I've had in the past couple of years. Um, but yeah, at the time, it was definitely a lot of doubt, a lot of uncertainty in terms of kind of how I would be able to continue music going forward,
Yeah.
just because I was already, I hate to say doing it part time, but not necessarily doing it full time, prior to the pandemic. Um, but yeah, one big thing was it also allowed me to kind of think about what I really want to be doing.
Yeah.
I think all of us had that experience in 2020 where we were forced to kind of look ourselves in the mirror and say, hey, this is life is finite, and we really have to focus on the things that we care about and what we want to be doing. And so, yeah, in a weird way, I think that helped give me a little extra push in the back to say, um, this day job has been comfortable and it's nice having a steady income, but when I'm being honest with myself, what I really want to be doing is the music part. And so, yeah, I think through all the challenges, a couple pretty important silver linings for myself.
What a great backstory. Yeah. I mean, a lot of it was fueled by going through that self-reflection. And I'm curious, anytime an album comes out, it's a huge statement, artistically and otherwise, on your imprint, not only in the world of jazz, but in recorded music. So, what are you ultimately hoping the listener gets from this album?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, yeah, actually, I mean, you framed it really well, Joe. Being the first album that I'm putting out, and also um, really the first time even my close friends and family are hearing a lot of my original music. It was just an opportunity to kind of share what I've been doing musically, over the past decade or so.
Yeah.
Just because in Los Angeles, I was more or less, working, but not really doing anything creatively or pushing kind of my creative project out. Um, so yeah, I think it's just an opportunity to share who I am as a person, and doing that via this vehicle of music. Um, yeah, I guess one layer further, I think you probably heard, Joe, the album kind of spans a very large range of styles, if you will.
Yeah.
Everything from kind of straight ahead hard bop, post bop to kind of the hip hop backbeat tune to more modern jazz leaning things. Um, and that's, I try to be as true to myself as I could in that sense as well. Obviously I grew up loving, what we call jazz or this music, you know, that we all have fallen into.
Yeah.
But you know, I also grew up listening to a lot of hip hop and a lot of R&B and neo soul and uh, you know, a lot of Whitney Houston and a lot of oldies and also classical music. And then I have this Japanese American Japanese, you know, music influence component as well. So um, yeah, that was a little bit of a, I guess, a decision early on of, you know, especially being the debut album, to kind of lean into um, maybe what falls in line with what a traditional, you know, jazz debut album would look like, or um, honestly, I just kind of played and recorded what I wanted to play and record, you know.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's. I hope people hear it, and I hope people get a pretty honest image of, you know, who I am as a person and as a musician.
And I think that's the beauty of having new blood and having successive generations come up in jazz is that this is an art form that has always evolved from the early days when bebop came around and they called the old cats old figs, and there's always been this kind of revolution. That's what jazz is. It's kind of um, it's not the popular music. There's such a cauldron of creativity. So I see all these elements that you put into it as very hopeful. And a lot of these young cats that are out doing elements of hip hop and elements of chill hop and trip hop and all of that. That's just a part of kind of the cauldron of what jazz has always been. It's an evolutionary musical step for us.
Right, right. And I think it's you know, it's a very um, paradoxical space to live in, right? Where on one hand, especially, you know, as non-Black Americans participating in this music that is very deeply rooted in Black American music traditions, it's a for me, you know, I find it challenging to kind of navigate those waters sometimes. But you know, I always keep in mind this paradox of, on one hand, it's important to understand where the music comes from, right? Because in order to participate in it, we have to understand the history and you know, be able to respect where the music came from, the history of what caused this music to be created in the first place. But on the other hand, like you said, you know, we don't want to get stuck necessarily, or we don't want it to be in past tense, right?
Yeah.
We want to continue to keep pushing the music forward and also celebrate it as a global art form in today's day and age.
And I think that's what Miles was going after. I mean, obviously Miles had a massive vision that transcended a lot of probably what we even understand, but that was kind of what he was doing. He was harnessing the power. I mean, even someone like John Lennon, who, when people think about the Beatles, they think about the early years and the later years. He kind of invented feedback and invented all of these little things. And if he would have been alive, he would have done some things that his son Sean Lennon's been doing, which his music's amazing. So I think it's the spirit of the musician that just keeps that they keep an eye on what's in the rearview mirror, but they're also looking into the future, which is kind of what I try to do with Neon Jazz. I don't want everybody to get pigeonholed into the 50s. It was a wondrous era of jazz, but there's a lot of cats right now that are making music that is totally fresh and new, and we have to celebrate the entire idiom as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you know, this jazz music in and of itself can be very esoteric, right? And very um, kind of exclusive in certain ways if you're not familiar with the music. And um, you know, people wonder why jazz isn't popular or why people don't really lean towards jazz. But you know, if you're not a musician, if you hear somebody soloing on giant steps for 8 minutes, right? That's probably not going to do much for you.
Yeah.
And a lot of my favorite musicians, you know, folks like Roy Hargrove and Donald Byrd and Miles Davis, you know, they always talked about um, how, as musicians, we can get so deep into this music because it is a complex art form, because there is so much history and so many influences that we have to understand that go into the music. But at the end of the day, we also have to bring the music to the people, right? And make it accessible to the audiences um, for whom we have made this music.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we can make the most complicated. Uh, I guess this is a little bit contradictory because I know I have some mixed meter stuff in the album, but you know, we can make the most complicated, intricate, most complicated, you know, jazz theory based tunes out there. But if that doesn't do anything for the general audience, then you know, we're just making music for ourselves amongst musicians, and that only takes the music so far. And so that's one thing that I always respected and appreciated, and quite frankly, just enjoyed, listening to Roy's albums or Miles's albums, where, um, Roy would throw like a Sam Cooke tune in there in the album, right? Or he would
Yeah.
make these melodies that, even to the general audience, is hummable and relatable and not too
Hmm.
complicated. Um, that's something, I think directly and indirectly I kind of kept in mind throughout the album as well, where, um, yeah, obviously we don't want to limit ourselves creatively, um, but also I think there's something intrinsic about a message that is easily digestible, no matter what your uh, level of musical understanding is.
Absolutely. So we're relatively neighbors based on where you were from. I'm in Kansas City. You're from St. Louis.
Yeah,
So talk to me a little bit about the beginnings of this journey into the music and more specifically jazz, maybe influences. How did all this start for you?
yeah, totally. So I can start. My parents are both from Japan. They got married over there, and then my father was in the steel industry. And so that kind of explains the nomading around the Rust Belt over here in the States. But basically got married, subsequently moved to St. Louis immediately, where my siblings and I were born. And so yeah, from an early age, my mother was a big music appreciator, and a musician back in Japan as well. And so I think ever since we were babies, probably before I can even remember, she would always have classical music playing in the house. Um, so that I've got to imagine, planted some level of kind of appreciation of music in my head. And then, yeah, you can probably relate to this show growing up in Missouri or the Midwest, but St. Louis specifically, just has such a rich history of music there.
Yeah.
Um, obviously with jazz, but also, things like R&B, rock and roll. And so, yeah, I remember, I think at the time I probably wasn't aware or cognizant of what exactly I was listening to, but um, just by kind of osmosis of being in a space like that, right? Whether you're driving around downtown or going to Redbird games, in the summertime, you naturally hear a lot of this blues influence and rock and roll influence, or bands playing at bars. Um, yeah, one memory that, kind of a classic example of not really knowing what you were listening to at the time. I remember Chuck Berry used to play, I think it was like a monthly residency at this bar restaurant down in the Loop. And so, yeah, I remember we got to see him growing up a couple times. And uh, yeah, I think at the time it was like, man, this guy sounds great. This is cool music.
Yeah.
And in hindsight, it's like, oh man, that was Chuck Berry we were listening to.
Yeah. There
Um,
was a there's a guy in Kansas City. His name is E. Pointer. He's a wonderfully innovative, talented musician, and he's in a outfit called the River Cow Orchestra. And one of the first times I interviewed him, when he was a kid, he ran into Chuck Berry getting ice cream for him and his girlfriend. He had like this crazy, like convertible Cadillac, and was just like blown away by how cool he was, and just the idea that you humanize someone like Chuck Berry going to get an ice cream for his girl. It's like there's something romantic about that. The whole notion. It's so Norman Rockwell.
yeah,
So
yeah, absolutely,
it's cool.
absolutely.
Yeah, I think about like even in Kansas City, there's so many jazz ghosts. Like when you get down to 18 and Vine, it's just thick. You just feel things in a different way. And even in St. Louis, I know that I went out there back in 2015 and was really wanting some jazz. And it was really thin. It was in the wintertime, late fall, and there was a lot of blues. And I remember that was kind of predominant at the time. But yeah, two huge towns that were dependent on railroads and people hopping on and off and really doing it up. So there's rich histories in both towns for sure.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
what was the first, like the seminal first live jazz show that you ever saw that blew you away?
Oh man, that is a great question. Uh, First jazz show that I saw. To be honest, it was probably a little bit later in life. Just because I've definitely had a little bit of an indirect route, to pursuing this career in jazz, and so I know a lot of friends who, were listening to all these albums growing up in middle school and seeing all these live shows throughout high school. I wasn't quite that hip, to be honest, growing up. I was more of a classical cat all through high school, and I had an appreciation for jazz, but I wasn't necessarily going out seeking different concerts in St. Louis and Pittsburgh. And so, yeah, man, that's a great question. Um, so I did middle school, high school in Pittsburgh, and at the time, Sean Jones was in the area a lot, and I remember he was probably the first trumpet player I got to see in person, where
Yeah.
it was like, man, this is incredible. You know, this is next level stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That's
yeah,
wonderful.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. You obviously had an epiphany over the pandemic and you realize that being a musician is where you want to be. But what is it that you look forward to the most every day about being a professional musician? What drives you?
Yeah. Um, I think this might be the case with many different art forms, but I think specific to jazz and the music that we play, um, there's no uh, there's no reaching the top of the mountain, right? You're continuously trying to climb and climb and climb, and you might get closer and closer, but um, at least for me, it feels like the more I dig into this art form, the more I realize I don't know, the more I realize I need to practice, more tunes I need to learn, and whatnot. So, um, yeah, honestly, it feels good to be excited to practice every day, to feel like I'm not, there's so much more I need to be doing. Um, if anything, just because I did take that kind of unconventional path to where I am right now. Um, I look at some other friends that it's certainly not with envy, but I see folks who uh, were shedding this music from like middle school and high school. Um, I spent some time in Seattle. They have some phenomenal high school programs that are, they're always at the essentially Ellington competitions every year.
Uh,
And I've worked with some of those high schoolers where it's like, man, I couldn't even play like that coming out of college, to be honest. So yeah, especially because I have a little bit of a late start. Um, for me, it's nice having a little bit of that chip on the shoulder, just because that's always going to be motivation for me to try to catch up with, if not peers, folks that are ahead of me, folks that I look up to, to try to get on their level. Um, yeah, that's definitely enough motivation, at least right now, to kind of kick me in the butt.
Yeah. So if you could get into a time machine and go back in time and see any jazz musician in the history of the craft, where are you going? Who would you love to see live?
Oh man, that's a great question. There's definitely many. Maybe going all the way back. Somebody like a Buddy Bolton, um, or obviously Louis Armstrong, but just in the sense that I think they were the original, uh, maybe like a Miles Davis in our day and age or a generation before us, in the sense that, um, they were living in this pivotal moment where they took all these different influences and kind of created this new thing, right? Somebody like a Buddy Bolton had all these different influences from marching bands, military bands to ragtime to church music to spirituals, and kind of brought that all together into this new art form. And so um, I think Miles, in a way, did that in a more modern context. To be alive to have experienced that in lifetime, I think that would have been a phenomenal experience. Um, and then purely just from some of my favorite musicians, I got a chance to see Roy a couple times towards the end of his career, but um, just to be able to see him more, that would have been amazing. Um, Bill Evans was kind of one of my first gateways into this music, so to be able to see him and kind of how he changed the form of the trio live in person, that's definitely up there too.
Yeah. So everyone out there has a perception of you, family, friends, fans, but you run the show. What's
Mm.
your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Huh. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think on a surface level, I've always had kind of this duality, right? Where I have the music portion of my life, and then I have the non-music or the day job portion. And for all intents and purposes, I've kind of kept those two separate. Everything from, the accomplishments that I've made in each field to even some of the friend groups that I have in both sides. And so, yeah, honestly, the most exciting thing was just to be able to share this other side of me with, the folks who weren't familiar thus far.
Yeah.
Um, and that includes even like family and close friends that I grew up with. Um, like my parents being in Pittsburgh and myself being out on the West Coast for the past, gosh, almost decade or so. they really haven't had a chance to hear me play or hear my music
Yeah.
since maybe like college.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that was one of the most exciting parts, was just to be able to say, "Hey guys, this is kind of what I've been doing, what I'm about."
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, from a musical standpoint, um, I think the album speaks pretty true in the sense of, um, I love this music, I love this art form, um, and I love studying it. I love studying the history and understanding, um, where the music comes from, um, the good and the bad, obviously, right? You can't really talk about um, jazz history without talking about American history, without talking about Black American history. And so understanding all of that context, I love that portion of it,
Yeah.
but also being able to take that and kind of make it into my own, and taking all the different influences that I've had, um, listening to uh, like the Commodores or Earth, Wind, and Fire growing up, and um, a lot of the J-pop, the Japanese pop music, and those influences that I've had growing up, and yeah, trying to create something unique, I guess, that isn't a replication of anything else or an imitation, and also hopefully not inaccessible or esoteric, but just trying to be as honest as I can with my music.
Right on. So the new album Evergreen is out. It's your debut. Where's the best place for people to pick up a copy or see you live? Anything about your world? Where can they go?
Yeah, definitely. So the album will be available on Bandcamp, on fortunearts.com, all streaming platforms, and then we'll have a West Coast tour, March, April timeframe of this year, and then other shows spotted out, New York City, we'll most likely be doing a Midwest tour through somewhere through the Pennsylvania to Missouri corridor. But yeah, plenty of shows to be coming this year.
Okay, right on. This has been great, man. Thank you so much. It's great that I'm so glad that we ran into each other. The album's wonderful. It's your debut, so good luck with everything. Have a great 2024.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It was a pleasure talking to you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. You bet.